Hello there. Just before we get into today's content, I want to give a quick shout out to a new friend of mine, the Mimic Box. The Mimic Box are a 3D print company that you can find on Etsy. These guys, in fact, and they're really, really cool and they're really, really lovely. They are based in Portugal and they do 3D prints and they ship them out at a very reasonable cost. And if you go to their website right now, go to their website and you order anything, just type in the promo code JJPainting for 10% off, just to share the love of the hobby. It supports them, it supports me. I'd appreciate if you did it. You support your own hobby, and let's get into it. Hello there, and welcome back to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and today we are talking all about Warhammer Fest. Yes, that thing which we all sat through for a whole week, and what we got out of it. Now, the debate on the internet is something which I don't really go into, but I did for this, for research, and I'll tell you one thing. I saw things. I saw things I never thought I'd see again. I saw things that I never want to see again in my entire life. I saw things, heard things, read things, and most of it I completely ignored. But there were a few interesting things that did come up, but I think we should probably unpack what we got, what we were expecting, and ultimately I think what it means for the future, and potentially maybe even a bit beyond what the announcements themselves were. And as always, we're going to be painting a model, we're going to be painting this model in fact. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, so instead of just recounting what happened in Warhammer Fest day by day, what we're going to do instead is we're going to take a look at things in three categories. The first category is what has been confirmed. And what I mean by that is stuff that we felt we knew was coming already, but all we needed it to be was confirmed. The second thing is stuff that is genuinely new information. So this is stuff that wasn't announced, wasn't teased, and has very much come out of the blue and is new for just about everyone who was there. The third category is going to be how this will be shaping the future. So this is very much where we start to speculate a little bit. But let's start off based on what we knew was coming. So obviously we had things that we very much knew were coming because of the teasing of various models. So the Witch Hunters, for example, and the new characters for both Slaanesh and for the Sylvaneth are things we knew from a little while ago. This wasn't new information, this was all very much stuff that we felt we knew was coming. And also on top of that, things such as the Soulblight Grave Wardens, as much as these are very nice models and we've seen a little bit more of them now, we very much knew that they were on their way. So whilst we do now have things like Plastic Blood Knights, Plastic Direwolves that have had a nice big update, those are things which are good, but that isn't necessarily new information. Now, also to skip ahead a few days as well, when we look at the Black Library side of things, there are things you could have predicted there as well. So, for example, the Warhawk Horus Heresy series novel, and arguably, some of the crime anthologies are things that we knew were going to happen. Now, we didn't know the specifics of things like Warhawk, but we could probably predict there was going to be another Horus Heresy book in the works at some point. And seconding to that, there was a few people online and a few bits of conversation I picked up asking why there wasn't more Forge World related announcements, why we didn't see more from Forge World overall. Well, I think there's probably two quite reasonable answers to that. First of all, with the Siege of Terror series ongoing, I think it's probably going to be easier for the Forge World game side of things with the Horus Heresy to come along and be updated after the series is ended, or at the very least when the Siege of Terror is in its final phases. So it does mean that we may or may not see it for a while, but I also think you have to remember that with the current narrative such as it is, with things like God Blight and the Dawn of Fire series shaping the Imperium, whilst bringing characters from the Horus Heresy into the present day, for want of a better word, there does mean that quite a lot of the events are going to be shaped. So it's possible that things that conclude at the Heresy are being shaped up to be directly involved in the future of 40k. So I just want us to bear that in mind, and I do honestly think that's a fairly legitimate reason as to why potentially we haven't seen much Horus Heresy stuff or much Forge World stuff. But in any case, those are just things to bear in mind. But these are all things that we very much knew were on their way, or could have at least predicted, as were, to a degree, the new Orc Snagger Boys. Now, things like the Pain Boss were dropped a few days ago, and even things like some of their new Snagger Boys were models that we had seen over the past few weeks. There was an Orc teaser a couple of weeks ago, so these are things that we knew. But at the same time, the other thing to bear in mind with that is that even though we knew it was coming, it wasn't entirely the scale of what was coming that we knew of. So things like the Squig-like riders, the Squig Hogs I believe they're called, which are a nice new addition to Orcs, and interestingly enough, having Orcs with cavalry is something which I don't think we were expecting to see in 40k. Welcome addition, in my opinion, and I think we should all be very happy that it's there. But it's definitely something which I don't think anyone saw coming, so it's going to be interesting seeing how it fits into the existing Orc range, how things are going to change around it, and what exactly they're going to be like on the actual tabletop. The models themselves look very nice, so it's going to be interesting to get to grips with those
those kits, which is always the next big step after these things are announced. And the last thing I want to say in terms of things that we knew were coming, so they weren't too much of a surprise when they arrived, very much falls into the category of the boxed games. So it's been speculated for a little while, and a few models have been teased for things such as Aeronautica and things that have been teased for the Diachasm. So we knew things were going to be moving along in that respect, but we just didn't know the specifics. But whilst the box games I do feel are a bit more of a niche overall, those are things that I think do matter and are worth mentioning at this point, because ultimately for those people who do play those games, and let me know in the comments below if you do, those smaller scale box games, it's very good that they're receiving the support and receiving the range that they need. I only faintly remember the original box games before they were discontinued in the early 2000s, and a lot of it just simply came down to not having enough support. So the fact that Games Workshop isn't just committed to giving them support, but is making them proactively up to speed with all the other models and all the other ranges in their two main games, I think is a very good thing, and one of the smartest things they've definitely done with the box games. Not so much with Titanicus, because they can't, but certainly with things like Underworld, Warcry, and arguably Necromunda, is making sure that all of these things can transfer over to the main games, such as 40k and Age of Sigmar. That's a good move, and that is something which I think should be celebrated. But to get back to what I was saying, to summarise all of these things, we have stuff from across all of the three major platforms that Games Workshop has. So 40k, Age of Sigmar, and its own IP boxed games. I leave aside the Lord of the Rings for the time being, simply because there's not a lot really to be said there, but ultimately those are things to bear in mind. But these are things that are across the board we knew about, but to have them confirmed and have a slightly clearer idea of what they're going to be, if not necessarily when they're going to happen, is good for everyone. And I think for us as players, it does give it more clarity as to what we can expect. Because the important thing to remember is that these are ever-evolving systems. In the old days of pre-7th and 8th and pre-Age of Sigmar, the games themselves would be quite static, and new releases would follow a very specific schedule, but they would always very much be the same kinds of releases. So with that said, the important thing to remember with a lot of the releases we see nowadays is we're not just seeing new models, we're seeing Games Workshop release things that we wouldn't necessarily see them or expect them to release in the way they were doing before. So those are things just to bear in mind. And the last point on the things that we knew were coming, I think it's probably worth just going back very, very briefly to the Soulblight Grave Wardens, because as we'll get to in a second, the fact that we knew about this new army that was coming, this new battle tome and this new range for the Faction of Death, those were things which were very much being hoped for a while, and the fact they've come at the end of an edition is quite an interesting one. So that means that when that book hopefully comes out, it will be ready for the next edition of Age of Sigmar and hopefully everything that comes with that. So that's something to bear in mind. Now let's move on to things we didn't know were coming, so genuinely new announcements for models that we hadn't seen before. So let's get the really obvious one out the way. Kragnos. Now, I think the most interesting thing about Kragnos is that he very much is what the Grand Alliance of Death need. One thing I didn't really touch upon much in my Age of Sigmarch videos is that every single other faction has at least something that feels like a head of state. And you can see that in Archaon, you can see that in Nagash, you can arguably even see that in Celestin Prime, and definitely you can see that in Morathi when you look at her. But what you don't really see much of in the Grand Alliance of Death is models or individuals that you can say are holding this all together. Gork and Mork are very much concept to the Grand Alliance of Destruction. The Grand Alliance of Destruction, I do think, in some respects, lack unifying or centralizing figures. So in that respect, at least, Kragnos is a very good addition. And the fact that he's arriving almost at the end of a similar cycle to what happened in 40k last year with the Psychic Awakening and in 2019 with the Broken Realms in Age of Sigmar, I think that's quite interesting overall. Also, I think it's worth mentioning the Broken Realms here very quickly for being slightly more compact than Psychic Awakening. I genuinely think they could have stretched it out to as many books as Psychic Awakening, but the fact that they kept it to only 4, or at least 4 so far, I think is a very smart move, because ultimately it means that it's a bit more narrative focused. While Psychic Awakening very much felt like the galaxy at war, here's a snapshot of everything at once, the Broken Realms continues what I was saying in Age of Sigmarch about the whole world being more narrative driven and fantasy having a bit more character to it. And because of this consistency, I think that's definitely served the game system and it served the factions in it incredibly well and kept them all easier to engage with and far more compact as a system. But then if we move on to other things that we didn't necessarily know were coming, we should probably take a second just to talk. We should talk briefly about the upgrade pack to the Cadian Shock Trooper. Now, if any of you remember my Imperial Guard videos that were a bit of an ode to the Imperial Guard and the Astra Militarum and their fall from grace, whilst I genuinely think this was a very good step for the Cadian Shock Troopers, I sincerely hope it's not the only one. The upgrade frame very much follows a lot of other similar ideas, so we've seen things for Necromunda that are very much upgrade frame orientated, and for all of the Space Marine chapters there have been upgrade frames for all of their shoulder pads and a few unique weapons. So it only makes sense, and I suppose it was inevitable that eventually upgrade frames for the Cadians would come around. But you have to remember, this isn't exactly a new concept though. There have been upgrade frames from Forge World in resin for decades for Cadian Shock Troopers. These plastic ones very much are just the latest in a very long line of things that the Cadians have had. The only difference is they're in plastic, rather than being in resin or even in metal, as they have been in the past. But that's not to say this is a bad thing, this is a very, very good thing. Forge World models can be notoriously easy to arrive miscast, or to get damaged, and be full of air holes when they do, which you need to send back. So by having them in plastic is good for the Cadian players, and whilst I do like the nice new helmets and a few of the new weapons, this is very much a cosmetic difference, and it doesn't really address the core issue that the Astra Militarum face overall. And also, I do think that it gives us a bit of an insight into potentially what this means for the Astra Militarum moving forward, but more on that later. The other thing that I think we should probably talk about very quickly are things like the Sisters of Battle. So, whilst we definitely knew that they were on their way, and we've had quite a lot of insight into what potentially was going to be in the Sisters of Battle for quite a long time now, the thing we didn't know necessarily about was obviously Morven Vol being available as a model, so having a High Lord of Terror as an actual playable model on the battlefield, that's quite nice, and it's very interesting that the Sisters of Battle got that and no one else. I think that's something just to bear in mind for the future, because it does mean that more and more of the high lords and the big characters and the big movers and shakers and head of state models, head of state figures within 40k will hopefully start to be involved more and more. If I distract ever so slightly and think back to a time shortly before this edition dropped, and I mean 9th edition and even before 8th edition, where the most senior characters in 40k were people like Marnie's Calgar and Dante and arguably Abaddon and Gazgul, the fact that they were all still very much subservient to other greater powers was always something. But now we have having characters like Mortarion, Magnus, Guilliman, and now one of the High Lords. These are people who are very much authorities unto themselves, so having them in the game is quite a big deal. And if I go back very quickly as well, just to the things that I said that we knew about coming, the reason I didn't really mention Sisters of Battle is because we've known about them for a very long time. However, now I feel like we've got a good sense as to what the entire range is going to be like once it gets its update. And now I think is a good thing for everyone, both people who play it and people who are just interested, because now rather than releasing what may feel like a half-finished range, I think the Sisters of Battle now are at a point where they have a more fuller and more complete range. In some respects, I compare them to the Necrons. The Necrons spent many of their early years, as I said in my Necron video, having a very limited range, which has been built upon over time, whereas I feel like the Sisters of Battle had that when they were first released a couple of years ago, but now they're being re-released in 9th with a more complete and slightly more cohesive range that I think benefits them immensely. But anyway, getting back to things that we genuinely weren't expecting, or things that we didn't necessarily know were coming, again, let's just very quickly look over at some of the novel choices as well. So we have lots of very interesting books that are featuring characters such as the Volpone Blue Bloods, and Lesk is back as well. These are all good things, and I'm very glad to see them coming back in new novels, because they were very good books the last time round. I think it's fair to say that anyone who's been reading the Gaunt's Ghosts books for a little while is very happy to see books about Urdesh and see the return of Squad Dantiok, potentially. That's going to be quite fun. But also on top of that, seeing the Volpone Glory novel, which is about the frenemies of Gaunt's Ghosts of the Tanith First and Only from the earlier novels. It's been a very long time since we've seen them, and it's nice to see them back in the books, and it's going to be very interesting to see where they go. And lastly, of course, the Twice Dead King novel by Nate Crowley will be very interesting. I have to admit, I'm very interested to see so many Necron novels coming out recently, because we've never really seen this for any of the other races. There were the Path of the Eldar books a few years ago, which did give us a trilogy on the Eldar and kind of the Dark Eldar, but that was it. There's not really been much since then, and every other novel largely seems to segue between Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines and Guardsmen, obviously, but that's kind of been it, really. We've not seen many of the other races getting novels. But now that we are seeing a trend moving towards Necrons, Orcs getting their own books, will we eventually potentially see books around other races? Will we see a Tau book at some point outside of Farsight? Those are things that I'm curious to know about. But this is a very good indication of the future, that the Black Library is moving away from just the Imperium in its novels and are now tackling other factions. And the last thing I want to say in terms of things we didn't see coming, those Gaunt's Ghosts models. Now, I'm old enough to remember the original Gaunt's Ghosts models when they were still just about in general circulation. And they weren't bad, they were metal, they were very unwieldy, and they were very monopose. But they weren't bad. They weren't bad models at all. But the fact that they are now out, they're in plastic, they're bigger, they're more dynamic, and some of those characters who are there, let's just say, are in more books than others. But it was a good choice, I think, to carry on all the OG characters from at least the first couple of books, and I hope that we'll be seeing more Gaunt's Ghost models as time goes by. Potentially we'll be seeing characters from the later books, and potentially even be seeing an entire range of the Gaunt's Ghosts, but again, that's on our futures section. And the last thing I want to say about things that we didn't see coming, going back briefly to the aeronautics, plastic Thunderhawks and plastic Xiphon Interceptors and the plastic Storm Eagles. All good choices, all interesting models, all things that I'm quite glad to see. And I wonder as well what this means for the future, but we'll get to that again in a bit later on. Just to summarise quickly, all the things that we didn't know were coming were all very much things that I think not only came out of left field, but in some respects were things that I don't think we were necessarily expecting or predicting to see coming along in the future either. So the idea that there would be plastic ghosts, for example, that's something I think most Guard fans had written off. The fact that there was a plastic upgrade frame, whilst people were expecting new things for the Astra Militarum, I genuinely think that this was something which they weren't expecting to see for now. And if we were expecting it, then it would have been with more. So this is on balance, stuff that we didn't see coming that's good, and stuff that we didn't see coming which I think needs a bit more time just to sink in, and also a bit more context as to where this is leading us. But all the stuff that I've said so far are also about the kind of characters and the kind of novels that are being released in the 40k realms, at least, very much do paint us a story that there's going to be more expansion and hopefully bringing things more in line with fantasy in terms of the narrative driving more of the universe rather than it being purely reliant on the sandbox open warfare game that has dominated the past of 40k. So this brings me on to my last thing. What does this tell us about the future? Well, there's three things I think we can say we know about the future now. So first of all, new edition of Age of Sigmar, and that's absolutely fine. But the interesting thing, which was, I think, worth mentioning, is that whilst we were told about a new edition, what we weren't told about is what's coming with that new edition. If I may flash back to last year when the Indomitus box was announced, that told us so much. There was going to be a 9th edition, there was going to be a new approach to Necrons, there was going to be a new approach to Primaris. Everything that was going to be coming with 9th edition was going to be something of a scaling up. So we got a lot of information very early on and a very complete look at the picture that was filled out as time went by. But they're keeping far more under wraps with the Age of Sigmar release. Yes, we saw some nice new Stormcast models. Yes, we did see a nice new Stormcast special character. But we've not seen if Soul Wars is going to change. We've not seen if there is going to be an announcement box, who they're going to be up against in that introduction box. And the really important thing for myself is that they're teasing it as being a new faction, potentially. I know a fair few people have already speculated that they are potentially going to be putting Skaven in the new box, which could be quite good. We've not seen Skaven in a starter box since Island of Blood, way back in one of the last editions of Fantasy. So seeing how they change could be very good for them as well, because ultimately the Skaven haven't received a huge amount of attention since the transition from Warhammer Fantasy to Age of Sigmar. So seeing what kind of updates they'll get and how they change and how they will now look is quite an interesting thing for everyone involved. Now, also the other things that we are looking into the future from and what we may be seeing is obviously more Gaunt's Ghosts novels, which is a good thing as well, because that was a nice little drop in there for certain. Because anyone who's been reading the Gaunt's Ghost book series know that those books aren't finished. And Dan Abnett himself, whilst having many projects on, seems very committed to giving them a satisfying ending. Now, whilst there was no new Gaunt's Ghost book announced, what that little teaser of what the new models are does definitely tell us that if we're going to be seeing Gaunt's Ghost models, potentially more of the characters from later novels and potentially more characters that might not even be part of the Ghosts, we might be seeing some of their allies come in and out. That also tells us another thing, is that more and more of Black Library's initial bestsellers and the characters from then the character-driven novels from the early years who've been around for a very long time are now starting to make their way into the game. We saw this earlier on with Uriel Ventress and Gotrek Gurnason, which were both very welcome in my opinion, but seeing how we're now seeing bigger groups rather than individual models being brought into the game into model form is very interesting, and I think it is quite good for us as players, but also means that Games Workshop in some respects may be slightly more willing now to take risks in bringing on those characters from the books, because ultimately they are popular, so there's no reason they shouldn't have models. And the last thing I think we should probably take away from all of this in terms of what this announcement tells us about the future is that whilst there were lots of things announced that do fill out some slots, so Aeronautics and Diachasm and Necromunda did get some very nice things that were announced for them. We're seeing a couple of new 40k factions that are expanded, and the Adeptus Sororitas we now have a complete picture on. Now obviously we have a more complete picture of what Orcs are going to look like, but there's a lot of things that they haven't told us about Orcs. They haven't told us what's going to happen with the rest of the range. They haven't told us if the Snagger and the new War Boss is going to be all of the new models they're releasing, and they haven't really given us a sense as to how they all fit together cohesively. But what we can say is that the Orcs are going to probably be the next big antagonist race to come into the game. Now, Orcs are an interesting one, and I will probably do a video all about them at some point in the future, because they've not exactly been left behind, but they haven't really received the support that I think most people would have expected them to receive by now. They are by no means dated models in most cases, far from it. They've held up very well considering some of their ages, but they've never really received the same sort of critical panning the same way Tyranids have, but they've not exactly been seen as a massive player in the more recent editions of 40k, and I'm not really sure why that is. But ultimately, Orcs are being revitalized, which is a good thing, and seeing how they shape is going to be very interesting for the future of 40k. So what I want to summarise on with what we're seeing for the future is a lot of races that previously haven't had their day in the spotlight for quite a while when we look at the two big games. And when we look at the more specific things, such as the boxed games, what we're seeing for the future for those potentially is, again, more cohesive and more fuller ranges than they had in the past. It's good that they're getting continued support. It's good that they're being pushed, and it's good that they're being given attention. And these are things that a few years ago Games Workshop may or may not have done with such reliability, which often I do believe led to the downfall of those games, is that if it's not supported, people won't be interested. But I feel that Games Workshop has learned its lesson in that respect. And even though there are still gaps, there are things which I think people would like to see updated. So I think people would like to see a Craftworld Eldar range that isn't over 30 years old. That could be fun. But ultimately, I still believe that that is still in the wings, and that hopefully will come around at some point soon. But as it stands now, we do have a lot of things that are starting to look very promising, and from the perspective of everyone, I do believe that the future is bright for players of every scale of game, whether you're playing small games or big games or the small box games. There was definitely something for everyone in the announcement, even if it wasn't so specific to individual armies, but I do believe that everyone gained something. And also, as a side note, one of the most interesting things was we had Warhammer Fest that went by that had no Space Marines in it. Wasn't that interesting? There was not a single Space Marine anywhere to be seen in that Warhammer Fest. And that tells us something else about the future as well. Space Marines, I think, have very much reached a point now where they're going to not scale back, but they're definitely going to allow them to breathe. With the rise of Primaris over the past 4 years, there has been a lot of Space Marine releases that have completely changed the landscape of 40k, but now I think we're going to be seeing other races get the attention and the love they deserve, and I think that's fair to say looking forward. So whilst there is a lot, it may not be the whole picture, it may not have absolutely every race covered, but it's covering more than just Space Marines, and I think that's worthwhile taking home. But in any case, let me know what you guys think. Do you think Warhammer Fest was a success? Do you think it was a failure? Do you think that there's so many things they missed? Or do you think there are so many things that they should have put in there instead? And what are you looking forward to from the future? What do you want to see happen from this particular point forward? What new armies, new models, new ideas do you want to see? Let me know your thoughts below. I look forward to hearing from you. So those are my thoughts on Warhammer Fest, what we gained, what we learned about the future, and what we will be seeing and what we may not be seeing for a little while, but what we do know is on the cards. But thank you all very much for watching. So like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays indeed. So thank you all very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.